the heavy clang of an iron gate slamming shut, echoing down a corridor of stone walls that seem to breathe with dampness. The air is thick, cool, almost musty, carrying with it the faint, ever-present smell of boiled cabbage and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a key turns in a lock, and a guard's footsteps fade into silence. And then, like clockwork, the sound that every prisoner knew too well, the rattle of tin trays sliding across a counter announcing that it was mealtime. But meals in historic prisons weren't just about filling stomachs. They were tools of control, of discipline, and sometimes, surprisingly, of mercy. Picture a bowl of thin, watery gruel in 18th century England, barely more than oats and water, steaming weakly in the cold morning air. Or imagine sitting in a drafty American penitentiary in the early 1900s, spooning up a gritty cornmeal mush that clung stubbornly to your spoon. It wasn't gourmet dining, that's for sure. Yet in their own way, these meals told stories about the times, about survival, and about what society thought prisoners deserved. And here's the surprising part. Not all of it was bleak. Among the endless bowls of soup and slabs of stale bread, there were moments of unexpected comfort. A rare slice of roast beef on a Sunday, a sticky oatcake drizzled with molasses in a Canadian jail. Even a mug of weak, frothy beer in 19th century Europe, handed out not as a treat, but because it was safer to drink than the water. Strange, isn't it? How something as simple as food could carry so much meaning. Over the next hour, we're going to journey across centuries and continents, pulling back the curtain on 25 surprising meals served in historic prisons. Some will make you shake your head, others might raise a smile, and a few just might stir your appetite. But every single one has a story of people, of hunger, of small comforts, and of the human spirit that clung to dignity even in the harshest of places. And before we dig into that first bowl of history, make sure you subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss the next journey back in time. Trust me, you won't want to miss the stories still waiting to be told. Gruel and silence. Imagine waking up in a damp stone cell. The morning air so cold you can see your own breath. The first sound of the day is the scrape of a tin bowl being slid across the floor, filled with a pale, watery mixture that barely qualifies as food. This was gruel, the classic prison breakfast of the 1700s. Just oats, water, and sometimes a pinch of salt if the cook was feeling generous. It steamed faintly, but the smell was neutral, almost ghostly, like something that had lost its flavor on the way to the table. Gruel wasn't just about feeding bodies, it was about control. Cheap to make and nearly impossible to enjoy, it reminded every prisoner that comfort was not part of their sentence. Some joked that you could see your reflection in the liquid, others muttered that it had more water than grain. The silence in the dining halls was deafening, punctuated only by the dull clink of spoons against metal bowls. And yet, even this thin porridge could spark rebellion. If a ladle was skipped or the bowl too empty, tempers flared. In some prisons, riots were born not over grand injustices, but over breakfast that felt like punishment itself. Isn't it something that one spoonful of gruel could hold so much power? The bread allowance. Now picture the heavy scent of fresh bread filling a corridor. In many English prisons of the 18th and 19th centuries, a daily bread ration was considered a privilege. A pound of coarse loaf, baked hard and dense, was handed out to each inmate. It wasn't the soft, airy bread you'd buy from a bakery. It was dark, chewy, and often studded with husks that scratched the throat. Still, in a world of watery soup and flavorless porridge, bread carried dignity. Bread was calorie-dense, reliable, and symbolic. To receive your loaf each day was to know that, at least for that moment, your hunger would be quieted. Losing it, whether as punishment or by theft from another prisoner, was humiliating. Bread became currency, traded for favors, hidden away for emergencies, or even soaked in water to stretch a meal further. Sometimes, though, the loaves were mold-speckled or rock-hard, baked in such massive batches that quality was a luxury no one could afford. Prisoners gnawed, tore, and even softened them in thin soups just to swallow them. And yet, there was comfort in the ritual. The thud of bread being stacked, the smell drifting through cold air, the knowledge that you'd at least have something solid in your hands. Bread, more than almost any other ration, became the taste of endurance. Cornmeal mush. Across the Atlantic, early American prisons leaned heavily on one cheap staple: cornmeal mush. Imagine a bowl of yellow, grainy porridge, thick enough to stand a spoon upright, steaming with the faint smell of toasted corn. Morning, noon, and night, it was served again and again. Cornmeal mush was inexpensive and filling, tied closely to American agriculture of the 1800s. The texture was coarse, with a grit that stuck between your teeth, and prisoners often joked that it followed them into their dreams. Sometimes it was ladled hot, other times cold and congealed into a rubbery slab. Either way, it was reliable fuel for long days behind bars. But here's the thing about monotony: it wears on the spirit. Inmates grew weary of the endless bowls, counting days not by the calendar but by how many mush meals had passed. Yet, for many, it was strangely grounding. Corn was a crop that shaped America, and even in prison, it connected them, if bitterly, to the outside world. Some prisoners even found ways to make it bearable, sneaking in scraps of molasses or saving a crust of bread to crumble in. A small act of defiance, a way to say, even here, I can still shape my meal. Saltfish rations. Now let's step inside a coastal prison in the 19th century. The smell hits you before you even see the food: sharp, salty, pungent. On the tin plate lies a strip of salted cod or herring, leathery and pale, its flesh preserved stiff from days of brine. Alongside it, perhaps a heel of bread or boiled potatoes. This was a standard ration in many maritime regions: cheap, plentiful, and long-lasting. Saltfish was practical. Ships brought it in by the barrel, and it could be stored for months without spoiling. But practical doesn't mean pleasant. The flesh was tough, sometimes requiring prisoners to soak it in water before chewing. The taste was overwhelmingly salty, the kind that dried your mouth instantly and left you reaching desperately for water. And yet, for many who had once worked the sea, it carried a strange familiarity. The smell lingered long after mealtime, seeping into clothing and bedding, clinging to the air in cells. Some prisoners loathed it, others found comfort in its reminder of the outside world: the harbors, the docks, the sound of gulls. In its own way, the fish connected them to a freedom they could no longer touch. Saltfish rations were more than sustenance. They were memory and monotony wrapped into one bite, an ocean on a plate, served behind bars. Boiled cabbage stew. Picture a massive iron pot bubbling away in a drafty prison kitchen, the air thick with the sulfurous tang of boiled cabbage. The leaves limp and pale, swirled in a thin, cloudy broth with little else to offer. Ladles dipped, bowls filled, and prisoners braced themselves for the smell that followed them back to their cells. Cabbage stew was one of those meals that looked as depressing as it tasted. The broth was watery, the leaves soft to the point of mush, and the odor, sharp and lingering, clung to clothes and bedding. Guards nicknamed it Green Death, while prisoners found more colorful terms, often whispered with grim humor. Yet cabbage was chosen for a reason. It was cheap, hearty, and full of vitamins that kept scurvy and illness at bay. In its way, it was survival food. But in the bleak silence of stone halls, it felt like little more than punishment in a bowl. The stew might have been practical, but it became infamous for one reason: its smell never let anyone forget it. Even hours later, as prisoners tried to sleep, the air still carried a reminder of dinner. It was a dish that lingered, on the tongue, in the nose, and in memory. Pea soup and weevils. Now imagine your bowl being filled with a thick, greenish paste, split pea soup. At first glance, it might seem hearty, almost comforting. But look closer, and you'd notice tiny black specks that wriggled just enough to ruin any appetite. Weevils, uninvited but all too common, were a grim garnish in many prison kitchens. The soup itself was dense, sticking to the spoon like glue. When hot, it had a faint earthy aroma, almost sweet. When cold, it congealed into a solid mass that could be sliced like cake. But no matter the temperature, the surprise of a crunch, caused not by peas, but by insects, was unforgettable. Inmates developed a dark humor about it, singing songs or trading jokes about their extra protein. Some learned to close their eyes and eat quickly, pretending not to notice. Others scraped the surface layer aside, hoping the deeper spoonfuls would be cleaner. Historically, pea soup was seen as economical, providing both calories and protein. But in practice, storage in damp, crowded prison pantries almost guaranteed infestation. Guards shrugged. It was food, wasn't it? For the prisoners, though, it became a symbol of disregard. Eating weevil-studded soup wasn't just unpleasant, it was a reminder of how little their comfort or dignity mattered. Black bread and coffee substitute. In a cold German prison cell of the 19th century, breakfast often began with a dense, dark loaf of rye bread and a steaming mug of something that smelled faintly like coffee, but wasn't. The bread was heavy, almost brick-like, its crust tough, its crumb sour and chewy. Paired with it was a drink brewed not from coffee beans, but roasted barley or chicory root. The bread filled the stomach, but just barely. It was the kind of loaf you had to gnaw through, each bite sour with fermentation. And that coffee? It gave off a warm, toasty aroma that tricked the senses. The first sip, though, revealed its secret: bitter, earthy, and nothing like the rich comfort of real coffee. For many inmates, this meager breakfast was both comforting and disappointing. It gave warmth on freezing mornings, yet reminded them of what they were missing. Outside those prison walls, families sipped real coffee, tore into soft rolls, and enjoyed flavors the inmates could only dream of. Still, even this substitute became ritual. Prisoners clutched their mugs, inhaled deeply, and for a moment let themselves pretend. Pretend they were somewhere else, living a life that wasn't measured by guards' keys and echoing corridors. Cold gruel surprise. As bad as hot gruel was, cold gruel was worse. Picture a tin bowl placed before you, the surface of the porridge solidified into a rubbery skin, the spoon sinking in with a faint plop. In winter, when storage rooms turned icy, some prisoners received their meals half frozen, the porridge stiff enough to be carved rather than eaten. The taste didn't improve with the temperature. Cold gruel was bland, thick, and slightly sour, with a texture somewhere between jelly and paste. Eating it required effort, breaking off chunks, warming them in your mouth, and forcing them down. Some prisoners joked that the spoon could stand upright all night without ever tipping over. But here's the curious part. This wasn't always neglect. Sometimes kitchens deliberately served leftovers cold, stretching yesterday's batch into today's meal. It saved time, fuel, and effort. For the inmates, though, it was an insult. To be given food that hadn't even been reheated felt like proof that they weren't worth the trouble. Complaints rarely changed anything. Guards shrugged, cooks ignored grumbles, and prisoners were left staring at bowls of congealed punishment. In a place where warmth was scarce, cold gruel became more than a meal. It was a symbol of indifference. Potato supper. Picture a prison dining hall in 19th century Ireland. Long wooden tables, echoing footsteps, and steaming bowls set down one after another. Inside, potatoes, plain and simple. Sometimes boiled whole, sometimes mashed roughly with their skins still clinging, sometimes served cold from the previous day's batch. The earthy smell of starch filled the room, heavy, yet oddly comforting. Potatoes were more than just food, they were survival. Cheap, filling, and abundant, they formed the backbone of Irish prison diets. During the famine years, though, this same reliance turned bitter. Outside the prison walls, people starved as crops failed, while inside, prisoners at least had steady, if monotonous, meals. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The texture was humble, crumbly when baked, watery when boiled, sometimes rubbery if overcooked. Salt, when available, was a blessing. Without it, the taste was bland, flat, almost punishing in its simplicity. Yet, for many inmates, potatoes carried a trace of home. They were the same crop families ate around kitchen tables, the same smell rising from village hearths. Even stripped of butter or cream, potatoes reminded prisoners of a world beyond the bars. They weren't feasts, but in their own quiet way, they were anchors of memory and endurance. Meatless Mondays. Now imagine looking forward to the week's one hearty meal, only to discover it's Monday, Vegetable Day. Reformers of the 19th and early 20th centuries promoted meatless diets in prisons, believing that beans, lentils, and turnips built moral character. The halls filled with the smell of boiling legumes, earthy and a little sour, drifting from enormous iron cauldrons. Prisoners quickly gave it a nickname, Hunger Day. Without the fat and richness of meat, the bowls of stew or boiled vegetables felt unsatisfying, no matter how full they looked. Beans were chalky, turnips watery, and the broth so thin it barely clung to a spoon. By evening, stomachs grumbled loudly enough to echo off the cell walls. Authorities saw it differently. These meals were cheaper, healthier by their standards, and a way to enforce discipline. After all, meat was considered an indulgence, while vegetables were plain, humble, and morally upright. But to those forced to eat them, it felt like yet another layer of punishment. And yet, even on hunger days, there were moments of resilience. Prisoners traded scraps, shared jokes about invisible meat floating in their stew, and sometimes even managed to coax a hint of flavor by saving salt or a crust of bread from another meal. It was survival with a side of stubborn humor. Oatcakes with molasses. In the cold corridors of Canadian prisons, mornings sometimes brought a rare surprise: coarse oatcakes drizzled with a sticky ribbon of molasses. The cakes were rough-textured, crumbly at the edges, and hearty enough to fill the belly. But it was the molasses, dark, glossy, and sweet, that transformed them. The smell alone was enough to stir memories. Rich and syrupy, it carried echoes of family kitchens, of biscuits fresh from the oven, of breakfasts shared at home. For prisoners accustomed to bland gruel and watery soups, even a thin drizzle of molasses felt luxurious. The sweetness clung to fingers, staining them brown, and made the oatcakes easier to swallow. Historically, molasses was cheap and plentiful in Canada, imported by the barrel. Adding it to rations was economical for prisons, but unintentionally, it also offered comfort. Inmates savored each bite slowly, stretching the taste, knowing it might be weeks before they saw it again. What made this meal memorable wasn't just the calories, it was the reminder of normalcy. For a moment, the walls seemed less oppressive, the morning air less cold. It wasn't freedom, but it was a flavor of it. And in a world where sweetness was scarce, that ribbon of molasses was worth more than gold. Prison garden greens. Step into the yard of a 19th century prison and you might see rows of kale, spinach, onions, or cabbages stretching under the watchful eyes of guards. Prison gardens were common, both as labor for inmates and as a way to provide fresh food cheaply. The soil turned under calloused hands, the smell of earth rising in the sun, the rustle of green leaves in the breeze. It was farm work done behind bars. When harvest came, the greens appeared in stews, boiled side dishes, or thin salads. For many prisoners, the taste of something fresh was a startling break from the monotony of dried grains and salted meats. The crunch of an onion, the bite of kale, even the faint sweetness of a carrot reminded them of meals outside, meals eaten freely. But there was also frustration. Prisoners who tended the gardens often had little say in what they ate. They could plant and weed for weeks, only to see the best crops carried off for the warden's tables, leaving scraps for the inmates.
That bitter irony wasn't lost on anyone bending over rows of green. Still, when the gardens did make their way into the mess hall, they brought color and vitality. In a world of gray stone and iron, a single fresh onion could feel like a gift from another life. Sunday meat rations. Imagine the sound of knives clattering against tin trays. The air suddenly alive with a smell you hadn't caught all week: roast meat. For many prisoners in the 19th century, Sundays meant a ration of beef or mutton. Thin slices, sometimes tough and stringy, but sizzling with fat that popped and crackled as it was ladled out. This was the meal prisoners waited for, the one that broke the monotony of endless porridge and bread. The aroma filled the corridors, lifting spirits before a single bite was taken. Even guards admitted that Sunday dinners calmed tempers, as men savored each chewy mouthful slowly, making it last. The portions weren't generous, of course: a thin cut of meat, maybe a boiled potato alongside. But in a place where protein was scarce, it was nourishment for both body and soul. Some prisoners even marked time by it, saying, "Just make it to the next Sunday roast." It was less about the taste, though it mattered, and more about the sense of normalcy. A proper meal, one tied to tradition and rhythm, reminded prisoners of family dinners they once knew. For a brief moment, the clang of gates faded, and what remained was the simple, timeless comfort of meat shared on a Sunday. Holiday pies. Now picture Christmas morning behind bars. The stone halls are just as cold, the air just as damp, but there's something different in the air: the warm, spiced aroma of mince pies. In some prisons, holidays meant rare treats: flaky crusts filled with dried fruit, nuts, or even a spoonful of sweet jam. Holiday meals were symbolic. They didn't erase the reality of prison, but they softened it for a day. A small pie or tart placed on a tray could stir memories of home kitchens, family laughter, and warm firesides. Prisoners often saved their portion, reluctant to take the first bite, savoring the anticipation as much as the flavor. The pies themselves weren't bakery quality, short on butter, heavy on dough, but compared to the usual rations, they were treasures. Sometimes chaplains or charitable groups donated ingredients, adding a layer of kindness to the gesture. For many inmates, that holiday pie was more than food. It was a message, a reminder that even in punishment, someone still thought of them as human. The sweet taste lingered, but so did the bittersweet ache of memory. Holidays inside prison were never easy, but those rare pies made the walls feel a little less cold, if only for a day. Beer or ale allowances. It might surprise you, but in parts of 19th century Europe, prisoners sometimes received small mugs of beer or ale with their meals. Not the hearty, frothy pints you'd find in a tavern, but weak, watered-down brews meant more for safety than celebration. At the time, beer was often considered cleaner than water, which could carry disease. Still, even a thin, weak ale carried a touch of comfort. The mug foamed faintly, the yeasty aroma rising warmly from the cup. For men used to endless bowls of gruel, the chance to sip something that felt familiar, even festive, was extraordinary. The portion was small, just enough to wash down bread or stew, but it created a sense of occasion. Some prisoners lifted their mugs in silent toasts, remembering taverns, friends, and laughter they once knew. Guards, too, sometimes looked the other way as prisoners lingered over their drink, stretching the moment. The portions weren't generous, of course: a thin cut of meat, maybe a boiled potato alongside. But in a place where protein was scarce, it was nourishment for both body and soul. Some prisoners even marked time by it, saying, "Just make it to the next Sunday roast." It was less about the taste, though it mattered, and more about the sense of normalcy. A proper meal, one tied to tradition and rhythm, reminded prisoners of family dinners they once knew. For a brief moment, the clang of gates faded, and what remained was the simple, timeless comfort of meat shared on a Sunday. Holiday pies. Now picture Christmas morning behind bars. The stone halls are just as cold, the air just as damp, but there's something different in the air: the warm, spiced aroma of mince pies. In some prisons, holidays meant rare treats, flaky crusts filled with dried fruit, nuts, or even a spoonful of sweet jam. Holiday meals were symbolic. They didn't erase the reality of prison, but they softened it for a day. A small pie or tart placed on a tray could stir memories of home kitchens, family laughter, and warm firesides. Prisoners often saved their portion, reluctant to take the first bite, savoring the anticipation as much as the flavor. The pies themselves weren't bakery quality, short on butter, heavy on dough, but compared to the usual rations, they were treasures. Sometimes chaplains or charitable groups donated ingredients, adding a layer of kindness to the gesture. For many inmates, that holiday pie was more than food. It was a message, a reminder that even in punishment, someone still thought of them as human. The sweet taste lingered, but so did the bittersweet ache of memory. Holidays inside prison were never easy, but those rare pies made the walls feel a little less cold, if only for a day.
Of course, critics saw differently. Reformers argued alcohol encouraged vice, and many prisons phased it out. But in its brief heyday, beer in prison wasn't just a beverage, it was a reminder of life outside. For a few swallows, the bitterness on the tongue felt almost like freedom. Chocolate treats. Close your eyes and imagine the rich, sweet aroma of chocolate drifting through prison halls. Rare though it was, some reform-minded prisons in the early 20th century introduced chocolate into diets. Sometimes as hot cocoa on a cold morning, other times as a small square of chocolate bar. The effect was electric. Men who trudged through endless days of bland rations suddenly found themselves savoring something indulgent. The warmth of cocoa spread through the body, cutting through the chill of damp stone. A bite of chocolate, melting slowly on the tongue, stirred memories of childhood sweets, corner shops, and moments of joy long before prison walls. Chocolate was more than flavor, it was morale. Wardens who allowed it believed that small comforts reduced unrest, and they weren't wrong. A few spoonfuls of cocoa could calm tempers, spark conversation, even soften hardened faces into rare smiles. Of course, it wasn't gourmet. The cocoa was thin, stretched with water, the bars often cheap and waxy. But compared to dry bread and cold gruel, it was luxury defined. Prisoners often spoke of those moments years later, remembering not the portion size but the feeling, that fleeting taste of sweetness in a bitter place. In the end, chocolate in prison wasn't just a treat. It was hope, wrapped in sugar, melting into memory. The Graham diet. Picture sitting in a stark American prison cell in the mid-1800s. A tray slid under the bars carrying nothing more than coarse brown bread, boiled vegetables, and maybe an apple. This was the Graham diet, inspired by health reformer Sylvester Graham, the same man whose name lives on in graham crackers. Graham believed that bland, plant-based food would purify the body and, more controversially, suppress immoral urges. In his view, meat, spices, and rich foods stirred passions that led to crime. So prisoners became the test subjects of his theory. No meat, no butter, no coffee, just whole grains, vegetables, and water. The bread was heavy, sour, and tough to chew. The vegetables were plain, often boiled until soft and colorless. And while the diet may have been healthier in some ways, it left prisoners unsatisfied. Many complained of weakness, of missing the taste of protein and fat. Guards reported tempers rising, not calming, and the experiment quickly lost its shine. Still, the Graham diet left a mark. It showed how prison food wasn't just about cost, it was about ideology. Reformers used the menu as a moral lesson, trying to reshape not only what men ate, but who they were. And for the inmates, it was proof that even dinner could become a sermon. Macaroni Mondays. Now imagine the surprise of sitting down in a 1920s American prison and being served a plate of pasta. Long strands of macaroni, pale and slippery, swimming in thin tomato sauce. To men used to bread and gruel, it felt exotic, even if the flavor was bland.
Italian immigration had transformed American food culture by the early 20th century, and prisons were no exception. Pasta was cheap, filling, and relatively easy to prepare in bulk. Some facilities designated Macaroni Mondays, serving it as a weekly staple. The dining halls filled with the smell of tomato simmering, garlic faint in the air, though often missing the richness of olive oil or cheese. The noodles were usually overcooked, sticking together in clumps. The sauce, watery and faintly acidic, carried more promise than satisfaction. But for inmates, even this was novelty. It broke the monotony and introduced flavors that many had never tasted before. Of course, not everyone welcomed it. Older prisoners called it foreign food and longed for bread and potatoes. But younger men, especially those from immigrant backgrounds, sometimes found comfort in the familiar taste. Macaroni Mondays weren't feasts, but they showed how outside culture seeped into prison walls. Each forkful was a reminder that even here, the world was changing. Rice and curry powder. Step into a British colonial prison in India or the Caribbean, and you'd find meals centered not on bread or potatoes, but on rice. Steaming bowls of white rice were ladled out, often dusted with a bright yellow sprinkling of curry powder. The smell was fragrant, spicy, but the taste, harsh and one-dimensional. Authorities thought this diet practical. Rice was cheap and abundant. Curry powder masked monotony, and together they seemed to provide enough calories. But for inmates familiar with real curries, rich with spices, coconut, or slow-cooked meats, the powdered version felt like a cruel imitation. The rice was often overcooked, sticky and clumping together. The curry powder, sprinkled dry or stirred into water, left a bitter, dusty aftertaste. It looked vibrant, but tasted hollow, a shadow of the flavorful dishes prisoners might have eaten at home. Yet even so, that yellow dust carried memories. The smell stirred thoughts of kitchens, street markets, and family meals. For some, it was bittersweet, familiar but stripped of warmth. For others, it was simply another reminder that prison could turn even comfort food into punishment. In the end, rice and curry powder was less about flavor and more about efficiency. But to the men eating it, it was a reminder of what prison took away, the fullness of taste and the dignity of a proper meal. Peanut butter rations. Fast forward to the 20th century, and another curious staple entered American prison diets: the peanut butter sandwich. 2 slices of plain white bread spread with a thick layer of sticky, nutty paste. Cheap, high in protein, and easy to prepare, it became a prison favorite, not by luxury, but by necessity. The peanut butter clung stubbornly to the roof of the mouth, demanding gulps of water to wash it down. Its roasted, salty aroma filled mess halls, and the crunch of peanuts, when included, broke the monotony of softer foods. For many, it was messy, dry, even frustrating, but undeniably filling. By the mid-1900s, peanut butter was a common ration in U.S. institutions. It symbolized efficiency, inexpensive, shelf-stable, and packed with calories. Some prisons even made their own in industrial kitchens, grinding peanuts into massive vats of paste. But what made it memorable wasn't just practicality. For inmates, peanut butter carried echoes of childhood: school lunches, family kitchens, simple sandwiches eaten in freedom. Even behind bars, it connected them to something normal, even comforting. Of course, eating it day after day dulled its appeal. Jokes about death by peanut butter circulated in cell blocks. Still, it was one of the few meals that most prisoners could stomach without complaint. Sticky, simple, and strangely nostalgic, it was survival wrapped between 2 slices of bread. Bread and water punishment. Picture being led into a bare cell, the door clanging shut behind you, and on the floor sits your entire day's ration: 1 slab of bread and a tin cup of water. Nothing more. This was the infamous bread and water punishment, used in prisons across Europe and America well into the 19th century. The bread itself wasn't soft bakery loaf. It was coarse, hard, and dense, often baked in massive batches that aged quickly. Every bite scratched the throat, turning to a paste that stuck to the tongue. The water was lukewarm, sometimes cloudy from old pipes. Together, they kept prisoners alive, but only just. Authorities saw it as the perfect deterrent. Nutritionally minimal, impossible to enjoy, and psychologically crushing. A day or two on bread and water could feel like a week, stomach rumbling in protest as you stared at the walls. Some prisoners joked darkly that the bread was harder than the cell bricks. But beneath the cruelty, there was symbolism. Food, something so basic, so tied to humanity, was stripped down to its bare bones. It was the system saying, we control not just your freedom, but your very sustenance. Bread and water wasn't just a diet, it was a message. Withholding salt. Now imagine sitting before a steaming bowl of stew, lifting the spoon and realizing something is terribly wrong. No salt. At first bite, the vegetables taste flat, the broth flavorless, every mouthful dull and unsatisfying. In some prisons, withholding salt wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate punishment. Salt has always been precious. In the 19th century, it was more than seasoning. It was survival, preserving food, and bringing it to life. To deny it was to deny comfort, dignity, and even health. Meals without salt left prisoners feeling not just hungry, but robbed of joy. The punishment was subtle but powerful. Unlike bread and water, the food looked complete. The bowl was full, the stew hot. But one taste told the truth. It was hollow. Inmates quickly noticed, and the psychological blow was sharp. It wasn't just about filling stomachs, it was about stripping meals of meaning. Some prisoners tried to save scraps of salted bread from other days, crumbling them in to reclaim flavor. Others traded favors for tiny pinches smuggled from kitchens. Guards knew that a sprinkle of salt could change everything, and its absence became a weapon sharper than any lock or chain. Salt, after all, was life's simplest pleasure. Taking it away reminded prisoners how little they controlled. Rotten meat incidents. Few things could spark anger faster than spoiled food. Imagine being handed a bowl of stew, the oily surface shimmering strangely, the smell sharp and sour before it even reaches your lips. Rotten meat slipped into prison meals either by neglect or cost-cutting was a scandal as old as prisons themselves. The taste was unmistakable, rancid, metallic, with a texture that turned chewy meals into revolting mush. Prisoners gagged, some fell ill, and whispers spread quickly through the cell blocks. Nothing fueled unrest faster than the suspicion that meals were poisoned, or worse, deliberately careless. Sometimes the cause was simple: meat stored too long in hot kitchens, or barrels of salted beef gone bad in damp storage. Other times it was corruption. Suppliers cutting corners, knowing prisons had little choice but to accept whatever they received. The aftermath was always the same. Anger simmered, voices rose, and riots sometimes followed. Meals were more than sustenance. They were trust. And when that trust broke, so did the fragile order inside prison walls. Rotten meat wasn't just about bad taste. It was about betrayal. For men with nothing left but routine, even the certainty of a decent meal mattered. Take that away, and rebellion was never far behind. Meal as reward.
Not all food punishments were about deprivation. Sometimes meals became rewards, a system where better behavior meant better plates. Imagine sitting down at the long tables and noticing your stew is thick with chunks of meat while your neighbor's bowl is mostly watery broth. That difference spoke louder than any lecture. Prisons often used food as an incentive, offering extra rations, sweets, or even small luxuries to inmates who obeyed rules. A slice of pie, an extra ladle of soup, or a piece of fruit could feel monumental in a world stripped of choice. Suddenly, the line between bland survival and satisfying comfort was drawn by conduct. For guards, it was practical. Food was cheaper than other rewards, and its effect immediate. A man who tasted richness once would strive to taste it again. For inmates, though, it carried mixed feelings. On one hand, it was motivation. On the other, it underscored inequality, the reminder that even flavor was conditional, doled out at the whim of authority. And yet, those small upgrades lingered in memory. Prisoners often recalled the rare sweetness of jam on bread or the thrill of an unexpected extra portion. For a few moments, they weren't just inmates. They were people, savoring something ordinary yet extraordinary. The last meal. Perhaps the most haunting of all prison meals is the one reserved for the condemned, the last meal. Imagine being told you could request anything: steak and potatoes, fried chicken, a slice of pie, or something as simple as eggs and toast. That plate set before you became more than food. It was a farewell. The tradition, rooted in centuries of practice across cultures, carried a strange duality. On one hand, it was mercy, an acknowledgement of humanity at the very end. On the other, it was ritual, a way to mark the boundary between life and death with ceremony. Stories of last meals often reveal deep emotion. Some chose feasts, piling their trays with foods they'd missed for years. Others asked for simple comforts: peanut butter sandwiches, ice cream, or even nothing at all. Each choice was a final act of agency in a world where control had been stripped away. And so, as the last clatter of trays fades and the echo of footsteps disappears down those long, cold corridors, we're left with a truth that lingers far beyond the prison walls. Meals were never just about feeding the body. They were about control, about survival, and, sometimes, in the unlikeliest ways, about humanity. Think back to those bowls of watery gruel, to the dense bread rations, to the pungent salted fish that filled cell blocks with their sharp scent. None of it sounds appetizing today, but for the men and women who endured it, those meals became part of their story. Each spoonful carried weight, not just in calories, but in memory. Hunger, after all, is something you never forget. And yet, amid the bleakness, there were glimmers of comfort. A Sunday roast that brought the warmth of family dinners back for just a moment. A sticky oatcake drizzled with molasses that reminded someone of childhood breakfasts. Even a simple cup of weak coffee substitute could spark imagination, carrying prisoners, if only in their minds, beyond the bars. What stands out most is how deeply food is tied to dignity. Denial of salt, rotten meat, or the cruelty of bread and water diets weren't just punishments for the body, they were punishments for the soul. But then there were last meals, offered with solemn respect, granting condemned men and women a final choice, a final taste of freedom. When we look at these 25 surprising prison meals, we don't just see history, we see resilience. We see the way people found meaning in the smallest bites, the way flavor, however faint, carried memory, hope, even rebellion. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. The meals we share today, the bread broken at a family table, the warm coffee on a cold morning, are more than food. They are markers of our lives, just as they were for those who ate behind walls of stone and iron. So the next time you sit down to a meal, big or small, take a moment. Breathe in the aroma, savor the taste, and remember, even the simplest plate can hold a story worth telling. The sights and smells were unforgettable. The sizzling of steak, the sweetness of pie, the froth of soda, it all carried weight far beyond flavor. Guards, cooks, and even fellow prisoners often felt the gravity of those moments. The last meal wasn't about taste. It was about dignity, memory, and closure. And for everyone present, it was a meal never forgotten.